Medellin, 1943. A child is born in the barrio of Antioquia to a mother whose name history does not bother to preserve with any tenderness. The neighborhood is not picturesque poverty. It is the kind of poverty that teaches children, before they can read, that the people around them are either useful or dangerous, and that the difference between the two can change without warning. Griselda Blanco Restrepo arrived into a world where the walls were thin, the men passed through, and the women who stayed learned to be hard in ways that did not always look like strength. Her mother beat her. This is recorded. What is not recorded, when what no document preserves, is the particular texture of growing up understanding that the person responsible for your survival is also the person most likely to hurt you. By the time Griselda was a teenager, she had already learned to read a room the way a person reads a threat. She had learned that softness was a liability. She had learned in the specific grammar of the Medellin slums that waiting for someone to give you something was a form of slow disappearance. What follows is not a story about a woman who became powerful. It is a story about what that power required, what it consumed, what it destroyed, and what it ultimately could not hold together. The empire came later. The damage began here in the barrio, before anyone outside that neighborhood had ever heard her name. There is a story that circulates about Griselda Blanco, repeated in court documents, in journalist accounts, in the testimonies of people who knew her later in life when she had the resources to have inconvenient stories buried. The story goes like this. At approximately 11 years old, Griselda kidnapped a child from a wealthier neighborhood in Medellin, attempted to ransom the child back to the family, and when the ransom failed to materialize, shot the child dead. Whether the event happened exactly as described is impossible to verify with the precision a court would require. What is notable is not the act itself, but the consistency with which people who knew Griselda believed it of her. Not as slander, not as exaggeration, but as biography, as something that fit, as something that made a coherent kind of sense when placed beside everything else they knew about who she was. That coherence is where the real story begins. Medellin in the late 1940s and early 1950s was a city sorting itself into futures. The coffee economy was shifting. Migration from rural areas was filling the hillside barrios with families who had left one form of precarity and arrived at another. The city's wealthier districts, El Poblado, Laureles, existed in proximity to the slums without meaningful contact. Children from the barrios learned the geography of that distance early. They learned which streets they belonged on and which streets would communicate through small daily humiliations that they did not. Griselda's mother has been described variously as abusive, unstable, and at certain points involved in prostitution, though the historical record here is thin in the way that records of poor women in mid-century Colombia are almost always thin. What is clearer is that the household Griselda grew up in was not one that offered consistent protection. The adults in her immediate world were not reliable sources of safety. This is not unusual for the barrios of that era. What may have been less common was the particular way Griselda responded to it. Most children who grow up in environments of chronic unpredictability develop some form of accommodation, withdrawal, appeasement, learned invisibility. Griselda appears to have moved in the opposite direction. People who encountered her in later life described a quality in her that they struggled to name precisely. Not aggression exactly, though aggression was certainly present, but something beneath aggression. A kind of fundamental refusal to absorb harm passively. A decision, made very early and never revisited, that she would be the one doing the determining. By the time she was in her early teens, she was running with older boys in the barrio. Not romantically, or not primarily romantically, but as a participant in the low-level criminal economy that structured daily life for young people in those neighborhoods. Pickpocketing, small thefts, the movement of stolen goods. These were not exceptional activities in that context. They were, in a straightforward economic sense, rational responses to the available options. What made Griselda notable even then was the quality of her attention. People remembered that she watched, that she cataloged, that she seemed to be constructing, even in those early years, a mental architecture of who owed what to whom and how that debt might eventually be collected. Her mother, by most accounts, was not a stabilizing presence. The beatings that Griselda later referenced, in rare moments of personal disclosure, usually to people she was simultaneously trying to manipulate, were not framed as formative trauma in the way a contemporary therapist might frame them. They were referenced more flatly, more matter-of-factly, as simple facts of the environment she had navigated. This flatness is itself a kind of information. It suggests not that the violence hadn't registered, but that it had registered so completely, had been so thoroughly absorbed into her understanding of how the world operated, that it no longer required emotional notation. The men who passed through her mother's life left their own residue. Griselda learned, watching those men, something about the economics of attraction and need. She learned that men with resources could be moved by desire. She learned that women who understood this could use it. This was not, in the barrio context, a cynical or unusual lesson. It was closer to practical education, the kind of knowledge that gets transmitted without ceremony between women who are surviving in environments where formal economic participation is largely closed to them. What Griselda did with that education, however, was not what most girls in the barrio did with it. The forged document trade that she entered in her teenage years was, in some ways, a logical extension of the surveillance habits she had developed as a younger child. Forged documents require understanding systems, legal systems, bureaucratic systems, the specific forms of paperwork that confer identity and legitimacy. They require knowing what officials want, what gaps exist in verification processes, what a credible forgery needs to contain to pass casual inspection. For a girl with no formal education beyond the most rudimentary levels, Griselda's entry into this trade suggests a particular quality of intelligence, not the kind that gets measured in schools, but the kind that constructs working models of how power operates and where its edges are soft. She was producing and selling forged identification documents by her mid-teens. The trade was modest. It was not by itself the foundation of an empire, but it established something important. A way of operating in the world that did not depend on permission, a business logic that ran parallel to the legitimate economy rather than inside it. And perhaps more significantly, it established for Griselda a sense of herself as someone who manufactured reality rather than simply inhabiting it. This sense of being a producer of conditions rather than a recipient of them would remain the organizing principle of everything she did afterward. It would make her extraordinarily effective. It would also make her extraordinarily dangerous in ways that would eventually circle back and touch everyone she had ever claimed to love. The Medellin she moved through as a teenager was also a city learning its own capacity for organized violence. La Violencia, the decade-long civil conflict between liberal and conservative factions that killed somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 Colombians between 1948 and 1958, had embedded in the cultural fabric of the country a particular relationship between grievance and force. Not every Colombian who lived through La Violencia became violent, but the period normalized at a structural level the use of targeted killing as a tool of political and economic dispute. It made murder legible as a form of problem-solving, in a way that would shape Colombian culture and Colombian criminal enterprise for generations. Griselda grew up in the shadow of that normalization. She did not invent the grammar of violence she would later employ. She inherited it, refined it, and deployed it with a consistency and a personal involvement that distinguished her even within a milieu where violence was common. By the time she was 19 or 20, the exact chronology of her early adulthood is difficult to establish with precision. She had already moved through several layers of the informal economy. She had acquired the habit of self-sufficiency. She had acquired the habit of distrust. And she had acquired, somewhere in the accumulated experience of those years, an understanding of human vulnerability that she would spend the rest of her life exploiting. The girl from the barrio had not yet become the godmother, but she had become something that the barrio had made, and that the barrio alone could not have contained. Carlos Trujillo was not a powerful man. This is worth establishing clearly because in the context of Griselda Blanco's life, a life that would eventually involve men of genuine and lethal influence, Carlos occupies a category that is easy to overlook. He was a small-time criminal, a man operating in the same narrow channels of the Medellin informal economy that Griselda had already been navigating for years. He was older than her. He had connections she did not yet have. And he was, in the specific way that mattered most to Griselda at that point in her life, useful. She married him. The year is recorded variously as the late 1950s, the exact date uncertain in the way that many events from this period of her life are uncertain, partly because records were poorly kept, partly because Griselda herself was not a person who preserved documentation that might later be used to reconstruct her movements. The marriage produced children. It also produced, for the first time in Griselda's life, a structure she could observe from the inside. The structure of a household organized around a man's authority and begin systematically to dismantle. What Griselda brought to the marriage was not what Carlos Trujillo had anticipated. He had married a young woman from the barrio, which in that context carried certain expectations. She would manage the household. She would raise the children. She would exist. In the social grammar of working-class Medellin in the late 1950s, within the radius of his decisions. These expectations were not unusual. They were the ambient assumptions of the culture, so thoroughly naturalized that most men who held them would not have been able to articulate them as expectations at all. They would have described them simply as the way things were. Griselda had watched her mother exist inside versions of this structure. She had watched what happened to women who depended on men who passed through. She had developed in response a quality of attention to power arrangements that was almost architectural. She could identify quickly and accurately where the weight was being held, where the structure was weak, and where a deliberate pressure might cause it to shift in her favor. Within the marriage to Trujillo, that attention took a specific form. She continued the forged document trade. She expanded it. She used the modest cover of domestic life, the appearance of a young wife and mother occupied with ordinary concerns, as operational camouflage. The household was real. The children were real. The marriage, in any emotional sense, was not. The forged document operation that Griselda ran during this period was more sophisticated than what she had been doing as a teenager. She was now producing documents not merely for individuals seeking new identities, though that market continued, but for the movement of goods across borders, for the construction of false business fronts, for the specific administrative requirements of a contraband economy that was growing rapidly in Colombia as the 1960s approached. The cocaine trade was not yet the dominant force it would become, but the infrastructure that would eventually support it, the networks of corruption, the forged paperwork, the officials who could be purchased, the lawyers who asked limited questions, was already being assembled, piece by people like Griselda who understood that criminal enterprise runs on bureaucratic manipulation as much as it runs on violence. Carlos Trujillo understood some of this. He participated to a degree. But the accounts that survive from people connected to this period of Griselda's life consistently suggest that the operational intelligence behind the enterprise was hers, and that Trujillo's role was closer to that of a front, a male name attached to activities that, in the social and legal context of the time, required a male name to be taken seriously. This arrangement suited Griselda in the short term. It gave her cover. It gave her a structure within which to operate. What it did not give her was a partner in any meaningful sense, someone whose judgment she respected, whose presence added something she could not generate herself. The marriage was, from her perspective, a tool. When the tool became a liability, she would discard it. The precise circumstances of the end of her marriage to Trujillo are, like much of this period, difficult to reconstruct with confidence. What is known is that by the early 1960s, Griselda had moved on, geographically and operationally. She had acquired new connections. She had met through the expanding networks of the Colombian contraband economy, men who operated at a higher level than Trujillo. Men who were beginning to understand that cocaine, not marijuana, not the forged document trade, not the small-scale smuggling operations that had sustained the informal economy for decades, was the commodity that would reorganize everything. One of these men was Alberto Bravo. But before Bravo, there is something worth pausing on, a quality of Griselda's that the Trujillo years illuminate with particular clarity. She had, by this point, become genuinely accomplished at performing versions of herself: the young wife, the mother, the small businesswoman, the loyal companion. These performances were not crude or easily detected. People who encountered her during this period and later described her recalled a woman who was warm when warmth was useful, deferential when deference opened doors, and capable of projecting a kind of earthy, maternal solidity that made her seem to casual observers like a woman whose concerns were domestic and whose ambitions were modest. This was a carefully constructed fiction, and the cost of maintaining it, the constant management of other people's perceptions, the discipline required to perform a version of yourself that is almost entirely invented, is a particular kind of exhausting. Not the exhaustion of physical labor, but the exhaustion of never being able to be entirely present in your own life, because part of your attention is always occupied with managing the story that other people are telling about you. Whether Griselda experienced this as exhaustion, or whether it had simply become so habitual that it no longer registered as effort, is something the record cannot tell us. What the record does suggest is that she never stopped doing it, that the performance of strategic identity became, over decades, so thoroughly integrated into her way of operating that the distinction between the performance and the person became genuinely difficult to locate. Her children from the Trujillo marriage grew up in this atmosphere. The specific details of their early childhoods are not well documented. What is documented, pieced together from later accounts, from interviews with people who knew the family, from the occasional court record, is that the household was not stable in any conventional sense. Money came and went according to the rhythms of criminal enterprise rather than legitimate employment. The adult world around the children was opaque in ways that children register without being able to articulate. The rules that governed behavior inside the home were not the rules that governed behavior outside it, and the children learned, as children in such environments invariably learn, to manage this discrepancy with a kind of premature sophistication. Griselda was not, by the accounts available, an indifferent mother in the conventional sense. She was present. She was, in her own terms, attentive. But the attentiveness operated within the same framework as everything else in her life. It was organized around utility, around the question of what this person needed in order to function effectively, rather than around the more open-ended question of what this person was and what they might become, if given the conditions to find out. This distinction between care as management and care as genuine openness to another person's separate existence would have consequences that would take years to become visible. At this point in her life, in the modest Medellin household of the late 1950s and early 1960s, those consequences were still forming quietly beneath the surface of daily life in the way that certain structural problems form in buildings. Invisible until the moment they are not. Carlos Trujillo disappeared from Griselda's life. The historical record does not preserve the specific texture of that disappearance, whether it was acrimonious, whether it was dangerous for him, whether she simply moved and did not bring him with her. What the record preserves is the aftermath. Griselda, in her early 20s, with children, with an operational criminal network of modest but real sophistication, and with a set of skills and habits of mind that the Trujillo years had not created but had sharpened considerably. She had learned, through that marriage, something that would govern every significant relationship she had afterward. She had learned that intimacy was most useful when it was asymmetric, when she understood the other person more completely than they understood her, when she could see the full shape of what they needed while keeping the full shape of what she needed carefully obscured. She had learned that the appearance of dependence, strategically deployed, could make powerful men feel secure in ways that made them careless. She had learned, in short, how to use closeness as a form of distance, and she was about to take that education to a much larger stage. She arrived in New York sometime in the early 1960s. The exact year is contested. Immigration records from this period for undocumented arrivals are, by definition, incomplete, and Griselda was not a person who announced her movements. What is consistent across multiple accounts is the picture of her entry. A young Colombian woman, traveling with children, carrying forged documents she had almost certainly produced herself arriving in a city that was in the middle of one of the most significant demographic and economic transformations in its history. New York in the early 1960s was a city absorbing waves of migration from Puerto Rico, from the American South, from the Caribbean, from Latin America. The neighborhoods that received these arrivals, East Harlem, the South Bronx, Washington Heights, parts of Queens, were crowded, economically precarious, and in many cases already embedded in the informal economies that developed wherever legitimate economic participation was structurally difficult. Griselda moved into this world not as a stranger to its logic, but as someone who had spent her entire life learning precisely that logic, in a different language and a different geography. She settled by most accounts in the Jackson Heights area of Queens, a neighborhood that had already become a significant node in the Colombian immigrant community in New York. It was a community that maintained dense connections back to Colombia, that operated its own informal financial networks, and that was, by the mid-1960s, beginning to function as one of the primary distribution points for the cocaine that was starting to move northward from the Andes in quantities that no one had previously imagined possible. The cocaine economy of the early 1960s was not yet the organized hierarchical structure it would become by the late 1970s. It was closer to a collection of overlapping entrepreneurial ventures, individual smugglers, small networks, family operations, connected by relationships of trust and mutual profit rather than by anything resembling corporate structure. The margins were extraordinary. The risks at this early stage were substantial, but not yet the existential risks they would later become as American law enforcement began to understand the scale of what was developing. Griselda entered this world through the connections she had built in the Medellin contraband economy and expanded through the Colombian community in Queens. She was not, in the early years, a figure of significant power within this network. She was a mid-level operator, someone who moved product, who managed logistics, who had the organizational intelligence to coordinate shipments and the social intelligence to manage the human relationships that such coordination required. What distinguished her from other mid-level operators in the same network was, by the consistent testimony of people who worked with her during this period, a quality of absolute operational focus. She did not get distracted by the texture of daily life in the way that many people in the drug trade did. By the money itself, by the consumption it enabled, by the social status it conferred. These things interested her, but they did not capture her. What captured her was the architecture of the operation, the question of how to make it larger, more reliable, more insulated from the disruptions that periodically destroyed similar enterprises. She was, in a word that she would likely not have used about herself, a builder. The household she maintained in Queens during this period was, on its surface, unremarkable. A Colombian immigrant woman raising children in a working-class neighborhood. There were other Colombian families nearby. There were the ordinary activities of immigrant life, the navigation of an unfamiliar city, the management of children in schools where they did not yet speak the dominant language, the maintenance of connections back to Colombia through letters and the occasional visit. People who lived near her during this period, interviewed years later, described a woman who was neighborly without being intimate, helpful without being open, and who projected a quality of settled domestic normalcy that gave no outward indication of what was being managed from inside that household. The children. She had 3 sons by this point, the older ones from her time with Trujillo, were being raised inside a double reality that they were too young to fully articulate, but that shaped them in ways that would take decades to become legible. Outside the home, they were immigrant children navigating the particular difficulties of that experience. Inside the home, they were present for conversations, for visitors, for the management of logistics and money that did not correspond to any legitimate business activity. Children in such environments do not necessarily understand what they are witnessing, but they absorb it. They incorporate it into their model of how the world works, of what adults do, of what constitutes normal activity and normal risk. Griselda did not, as far as any account suggests, make any particular effort to shield her sons from the nature of her work. This was not, in the context of her own upbringing, unusual. The distinction between the licit and the illicit had never been, for her, a moral distinction. It had been a practical one. A question of what required concealment from authorities, not a question of what was right or wrong. She transmitted this framework without ceremony to her children. By the late 1960s, Griselda had moved from mid-level operator to something more significant. The cocaine networks running through Queens and into the broader New York market were expanding rapidly, driven by a demand that the counterculture and the particular social dislocations of late 1960s American urban life were generating at a pace that suppliers were struggling to meet. Griselda's operation was well positioned to meet some of that demand. She had reliable supply lines into Colombia. She had distribution networks within the Colombian community and beyond it. She had, crucially, a reputation within the trade for a specific quality that was rarer than it might appear. She delivered what she promised, and she remembered what people owed her. It was during this period that she began to develop what would become her signature operational characteristic: the use of violence not as a last resort, not as a response to specific threats, but as a preemptive management tool, a way of ensuring that the people within her network remained reliable, not primarily because they trusted her or because working with her was profitable, but because the consequences of unreliability were vivid and immediate. The first murders attributable to her New York operation are difficult to date precisely. They appear in the historical record obliquely, in police reports that did not yet connect the deaths to a single organizing intelligence, in the recollections of people who survived the period and spoke about it only much later, after the protection of distance or legal immunity. What the record does establish is that by the early 1970s, Griselda Blanco was known within the Colombian criminal networks operating in New York as someone who killed people who crossed her. Not as a rumor, as a documented fact within the community, transmitted through the specific channels by which such facts travel in criminal networks, quietly, precisely, with the weight of evidence behind them. Alberto Bravo entered her life during this period. He was Colombian, connected to the cocaine trade at a level significantly above where Griselda had started, and he represented, in purely operational terms, an expansion of what she could access. He also represented something else, something that requires careful attention to see clearly. Bravo was the first man in Griselda's life who operated at a scale comparable to her own ambitions. The men before him, Trujillo and the various figures who had populated her criminal world in Medellin, had been useful in the way that tools are useful. Bravo was different. He was, at least initially, someone she appears to have regarded as an approximate equal, someone whose judgment she could test against her own and find, occasionally, credible. She married him. The marriage was not a performance of domesticity in the way the Trujillo marriage had been. It was closer to a business merger, two operations combining under a shared structure, with the expectation that the combination would be more powerful than either constituent part. For a time, it was. The New York operation in the early 1970s, under the combined structure of Griselda and Bravo's networks, was moving cocaine in quantities that were beginning to attract serious attention from federal law enforcement. The DEA, established in 1973, was still developing its understanding of the Colombian networks operating on the East Coast. But the attention was increasing. Arrests were happening in the periphery of Griselda's operation. Lower-level figures, distributors, couriers. The center held, but the pressure around it was building. Griselda's response to this pressure was, characteristically, not withdrawal. It was reorganization. She began restructuring her operation to distribute risk more widely, more layers between herself and the product, more intermediaries, more redundancy in the distribution network. She was learning in real time how to build a criminal enterprise that could absorb the loss of individual components without collapsing. This was sophisticated organizational thinking. It was also thinking that required a fundamental indifference to the individuals who made up those components, an ability to view people as interchangeable parts in a system rather than as persons with claims on her consideration. This indifference was not new. It had been present in nascent form since the barrio. What the New York years did was give it scale and organizational expression. The apartment in Queens, the children coming home from school, the neighbors who knew her as a Colombian woman managing a household, all of it continued. The surface of ordinary life remained intact. Beneath it, something was consolidating that had no ordinary name, and that would, in the years ahead, exceed anything that had yet been imagined. Uber Trujillo was the oldest. He was born into the Medellin years, into the household of Carlos Trujillo, into a world that was already organized around concealment and calculation before he was old enough to understand either word. By the time Griselda moved the family to New York, Uber was a child navigating the specific disorientation of immigration, a new language, a new city, a new set of social rules, while simultaneously inhabiting a home where the adult world operated according to principles that had no correspondence to anything the new city's institutions would have recognized as normal. Osvaldo and Dixon came later. Osvaldo was Alberto Bravo's son, born into the New York years, into a household that had by then become the operational center of a growing cocaine distribution network. Dixon was born to Griselda and her third husband, Dario Sepulveda, in the mid-1970s, the child of a marriage that was already, by the time of his birth, beginning to accumulate the particular tensions that would eventually make it lethal. 3 sons, 3 different fathers, 3 different chapters of their mother's criminal ascent, each one arriving into a world that was larger, more dangerous, and more completely organized around Griselda's will than the one that had preceded it. What Griselda understood about children was primarily what she had learned from her own childhood, which is to say, she understood them as people who needed to be prepared for a world that would not accommodate weakness. This was not an unusual framework in the environments she had moved through. It was the dominant parenting philosophy of the Medellin slums, transmitted across generations with the consistency of something that had been tested and found functional. You did not raise children to be soft, you raised them to survive. The specific content of that preparation in Griselda's household was shaped by the nature of her work in ways that were not incidental. The conversations that happened around the dinner table, the visitors who came and went, the phone calls that required sudden silence, the envelopes of money that appeared and disappeared. All of this was part of the curriculum, whether or not it was consciously offered as such. The boys were learning, from the earliest age at which children begin to construct models of the adult world, that the adult world their mother inhabited was one organized around power, around the management of threat, and around a loyalty that was absolute and non-negotiable. The word loyalty appeared frequently in the accounts of people who knew Griselda during her children's formative years. She used it often. She treated it as the primary moral category, the value against which all other values were measured and found either consistent or deficient. Loyalty to her, to the operation, to the family, as she defined it. Disloyalty, in any form, was the one unforgivable transgression. This framework gave the boys a clear moral structure. It also gave them a moral structure that had almost no content outside of their relationship to their mother and her enterprise. Questions of right and wrong, in the broader sense, the sense that has to do with what you owe to people who are not your family, to people who are your enemies, to the strangers who are injured by the business you are part of. These questions simply did not exist in the framework Griselda provided. They were not suppressed or actively rejected. They were absent in the way that a language is absent from a child who has never been exposed to it. Uber was the first to become operationally involved. The exact age at which he began participating in his mother's business is difficult to establish with precision, but by his late teens he was functioning as a trusted member of the network, running errands that shaded into more serious tasks, being present at meetings where the content was not domestic, developing the particular set of skills that criminal enterprise requires of young men who have grown up inside it. He was, by multiple accounts, genuinely capable. He had his mother's quality of attention, her ability to read rooms and people, her organizational instincts. He also had something his mother had in abundance, but had learned over years of operational experience to manage carefully a volatile relationship with perceived disrespect. The capacity for sudden, disproportionate violence in response to slights that other people might have absorbed without incident. In Griselda, this quality had been disciplined by strategic intelligence. She had learned over decades to distinguish between situations that required immediate violent response and situations where patience served her better. Uber had not yet developed this discipline. He had absorbed the capacity for violence without yet developing the calculus that made violence, in his mother's hands, a tool rather than a reflex. This distinction would matter. It would matter in ways that were already implicit in the late 1970s, when the family moved to Miami and the operation expanded into territory where the consequences of undisciplined violence were swift and permanent. Osvaldo was different from Uber in ways that the record suggests, but does not fully illuminate. He was quieter, less immediately visible in the operational accounts that survive from this period. Where Uber was present at the front edge of his mother's enterprise, at the meetings, in the streets, in the confrontations, Osvaldo occupied a more interior position. He was there, but he was harder to see. What the record does preserve about Osvaldo is the quality of his attachment to his mother, an attachment that people who knew the family described as intense even by the standards of a household where loyalty was the central organizing value. He was the son who stayed closest, the one who seemed least able to construct an existence with any significant distance from Griselda's gravity. Whether this was temperament or whether it was the specific consequence of having been raised in the New York years, when the operation was at its most consuming and Griselda's attention was most thoroughly occupied by its demands, is impossible to determine from the outside. What can be said is that Osvaldo, of all three boys, seems to have had the greatest difficulty locating a self that existed independently of his mother's narrative about who he was and what he was for. This difficulty would not have been evident to casual observers. In the external world he functioned, but the external functioning and the internal reality appeared to have been, from early on, substantially disconnected. Dixon was the youngest, and in some ways the most painful case to examine closely. He was born into the Miami years, into the period of maximum violence, maximum wealth, and maximum instability that Griselda's operation produced in the late 1970s and early 1980s. His father was Dario Sepulveda, whose relationship with Griselda was already deteriorating by the time Dixon was old enough to have memories. The custody battle between Griselda and Sepulveda was not a dispute conducted through family court in any ordinary sense. It was conducted through the specific mechanisms available to people operating in their world. Through threat, through counter-threat, through the mobilization of violence as a negotiating instrument. Sepulveda took Dixon to Colombia at one point, in what appears to have been an attempt to use the child as leverage in his deteriorating relationship with Griselda. The response was immediate and unambiguous. Sepulveda was killed. The killing was ordered by Griselda. Dixon was returned to her. Dixon was approximately 3 years old when his father was murdered on his mother's instruction. The particular cruelty of this, not as moral judgment but as psychological fact, is that it left Dixon in an impossible position that he could not yet understand and would spend years trying to navigate. His mother had killed his father. This was not a secret within the family's world, though it was obviously not something that could be spoken about openly in most contexts. Dixon grew up holding this knowledge, absorbing it gradually across childhood, in fragments, inside a family structure where his mother was the absolute center of gravity, the source of all provision and all safety, the person whose love was the only love available to him. To survive emotionally in that position required a form of psychological accommodation that was, in any clinical sense, deeply damaging. You cannot process the murder of your father by the person you depend on for everything. You can only find ways to not process it, to wall it off, to hold it at a distance, to maintain a functional relationship with your mother by developing the capacity to compartmentalize in ways that exact their own cost over time. The three boys were not identical in their responses to the world Griselda had built around them. They had different temperaments, different positions within the family hierarchy, different relationships to their absent or dead fathers, but they shared something that was the direct product of their upbringing, a model of human relationship in which power was the primary currency, in which loyalty was absolute and its violation catastrophic, and in which the ordinary transactions of emotional life, vulnerability, uncertainty, the willingness to be known by someone without knowing the outcome, were not available as options. They had been raised in the most literal sense for the enterprise. Not through explicit instruction, Griselda does not appear to have sat her sons down and explained the business to them in pedagogical terms, but through the accumulated experience of living inside it, of watching their mother operate, of absorbing the values and the methods and the fundamental orientation toward other people that made the enterprise possible. By the late 1970s, all three were involved in some capacity. Uber most directly, Dixon too young for full involvement, but already orbiting its edges, Osvaldo present in the ways he was always present, close, watchful, carrying the weight of his attachment with a steadiness that might, to an outside observer, have resembled stability, but that was closer to something else entirely. Griselda, for her part, spoke about her sons with a consistency that people who knew her found striking. She loved them, she said. She did everything for them. She built what she built for them. These statements were not, in the way she made them, performances or manipulations. They appear to have been genuinely felt, a real emotional conviction that the enterprise she had constructed and the violence it required and the world it had created around her children were acts of maternal provision rather than maternal destruction. This conviction was not the product of self-deception in the simple sense. It was the product of a framework within which the categories of provision and destruction were not in conflict, within which giving your children power, hardness, and operational capability in a dangerous world was the same thing as giving them love, within which the alternative, softness, vulnerability, the kind of openness to the world that might have given them other options, was simply another word for leaving them defenseless. She had been left defenseless once. She had decided in the barrio that this would not happen to her again. She extended that decision to her sons. She armored them in the only materials she had available. The armor held for a time. Then it became the thing that killed them. Miami in 1978 was a city that did not yet know what it was about to become. The tourist infrastructure was aging. The economy was uneven. The population was shifting rapidly as Cuban exiles, Haitian refugees, and Colombian immigrants moved into neighborhoods that the white middle class had been quietly leaving for the northern suburbs throughout the previous decade. The city had the feel of something between states. Not quite what it had been, not yet what it was becoming, inhabiting a transitional moment with the particular instability that transitions produce. Griselda arrived into this instability like a weight dropped into water. The displacement was immediate and would take years to fully register. She came from New York, where the operation had grown substantial, but had also grown complicated by the increasing attention of federal law enforcement. The indictment that would eventually be filed against her in New York, a federal conspiracy charge related to the cocaine network she had been building throughout the 1970s, was already taking shape in the legal architecture of the DEA's New York operations. Miami offered distance from that architecture, a new geography of distribution and access to the cocaine supply lines running through the Caribbean that were, by the late 1970s, moving product in volumes that made the New York operation look modest by comparison. She moved the family south. She moved the operation south, and she brought with her, intact and fully formed, the operational philosophy she had been developing since the barrio. The conviction that preemptive violence, applied with consistency and without visible hesitation, was the most reliable method of maintaining control over a criminal enterprise in an environment where the legal system offered no enforcement of contracts and no protection of interests. What happened in Miami between 1978 and 1984 has been documented in fragments through police records, court testimony, journalistic investigation, and the recollections of survivors, both in the literal sense of people who were targeted and lived, and in the more diffuse sense of people who inhabited the Miami cocaine world of that period and emerged from it with enough coherence to describe what they had witnessed. The picture that emerges from these fragments is of a level of violence that was not, even by the standards of the cocaine trade, ordinary. The Dadeland Mall shooting in July 1979, a daylight attack in a busy shopping center that left 2 men dead and several bystanders wounded, conducted by assassins who carried automatic weapons into a liquor store and opened fire with a thoroughness that had no precedent in American organized crime, was attributed to Griselda's organization, it was not the first killing connected to her Miami operation. It was the one that made the violence visible to a public that had not previously understood the scale of what was happening in the city around them. The name that journalists and law enforcement began using, the Cocaine Cowboys, captured something real about the period. The speed, the brazenness, the almost theatrical quality of violence that was conducted in public, in daylight, without apparent concern for witnesses or consequences. What it did not capture, or did not capture fully, was the organizing intelligence behind the most sustained and systematic portion of that violence. The cowboys were visible. The person directing the enterprise from behind layers of intermediaries was not. Griselda's specific contribution to the Miami cocaine wars was not primarily the violence itself. Violence was ambient in that world. Other organizations were killing, other networks were fighting over territory and supply lines with the same basic tools. What Griselda contributed was a management philosophy of violence that was distinctively hers. The use of killing not only as a response to specific threats or disputes, but as a constant environmental feature of her organization, a standing condition that the people around her experienced as permanent and inescapable. People who worked within her organization during this period described something that went beyond ordinary fear of consequences. It was closer to a condition of total environmental saturation, the understanding that there was no action available to you, no conversation you might have, no relationship you might form that existed outside her awareness and her potential response. This understanding was maintained not only by the killings themselves, but by the specificity and the personalization of those killings, by the fact that Griselda frequently involved herself in the details of who was targeted, how the killing was conducted, and what message the method was intended to send. She was not a remote administrator of violence. She was, by the accounts of people within the organization, actively engaged in the operational decisions that produced individual deaths. This engagement was not merely practical, not simply the result of being unable to delegate. It appears to have been, in some dimension, volitional. A preference for proximity to the act that exceeded what organizational efficiency would have required. The motorcycle assassin became her signature. The image recurs across the Miami killings, attributed to her organization, a gunman on a motorcycle, approaching a target in traffic or outside a business, firing at close range, and disappearing into the city before the witnesses had finished registering what they had seen. The method was efficient. It was also, in the context of the Miami cocaine world, visually distinctive enough to function as a kind of organizational signature. A way of marking territory and communicating authorship that other networks would understand even if law enforcement was slow to connect the pattern. The number of killings attributed to Griselda's Miami operation varies depending on the source. Law enforcement estimates during the period ran as high as 40 individual murders. Later investigations, drawing on informant testimony and forensic reconstruction, have suggested figures that may be higher. What is consistent across the estimates is the sustained quality of the violence. Not a single escalation followed by a return to equilibrium, but a prolonged condition of organized lethality that lasted years and touched an extraordinary number of individual lives. Behind each of those lives was a family that was not Griselda's family. People who had their own children, their own parents, their own networks of connection and dependency that were severed by a decision made somewhere inside her organizational structure. This fact existed in her world and in her consciousness in a particular way, not as a source of guilt, which the record gives no indication she experienced in any conventional sense, but as a kind of neutral operational data. People died, the operation continued, the two facts were connected by causality rather than by moral weight. The money during this period was extraordinary. Griselda was, by the early 1980s, moving cocaine through Miami in quantities that generated revenues that required their own organizational infrastructure to manage. The DEA estimated, in investigations from this period, that her operation was generating tens of millions of dollars annually. The figures varied and were, by their nature, imprecise. You cannot audit a criminal enterprise with the accuracy that legitimate accounting provides. What is clear from the physical record, the properties purchased, the cash deposits made through a network of front businesses, the lifestyle maintained by Griselda and her immediate circle, is that the money was real and that it was enormous. She wore it, not ostentatiously, by the standards of the Miami cocaine world, where display was a primary social currency, but visibly, the houses, the clothing, the jewelry. These things were present in her life in a way that testified to the scale of what she had built. They were also, in a dimension that becomes clearer with distance, a form of evidence. Every significant purchase was a record. Every front business was a paper trail. Every transaction that moved money from the cocaine operation into the legitimate economy created a document that could, under the right investigative conditions, be followed backward to its source. Griselda understood this in principle. She had structured layers of intermediary into her financial operations for precisely this reason. But the volume of money was, by the early 1980s, becoming difficult to manage with the rigor that concealment required. The scale of the enterprise was beginning to create its own vulnerabilities, not because Griselda's organizational intelligence had declined, but because the sheer mass of what she had built was generating a surface area that no individual intelligence, however capable, could fully monitor. Her sons were in Miami with her. Uber was fully operational by this point, present in the organization not as a peripheral figure, but as someone with genuine responsibility for specific aspects of the enterprise. He was also, by the early 1980s, becoming a visible figure in the Miami cocaine world, and in his own right, known by name, connected to incidents, accumulating the kind of profile that makes a person easy for law enforcement to track and easy for enemies to target. Osvaldo was present in the more interior way that had always characterized his relationship to the enterprise. Dixon was still young, a child technically, though a child whose world was the world his mother had constructed, with all that this implied. Griselda moved between the public-facing aspects of her Miami life and the operational center of the enterprise with the same practiced ease she had always brought to the management of her double existence. The Miami social world she inhabited, the Colombian community, the networks of legitimate and semi-legitimate business that surrounded the cocaine economy, knew her as a woman of means, of presence, of a particular kind of authority that did not require explanation. People understood without needing to be told explicitly that she was not someone to cross. This understanding was the product of reputation, and the reputation was the product of what had happened to specific people at specific moments. It was maintained not through continued demonstration, but through the memory of demonstration. The way that a single act of extreme violence, repeated enough times across enough contexts, becomes a permanent feature of the environment rather than an isolated event. She had built that environment deliberately. She lived inside it with a fluency that suggested she had never seriously entertained the possibility of living inside any other kind. The federal investigation that was building around her Miami operation during this period was more sophisticated than what she had faced in New York. The DEA's Miami office was, by the early 1980s, developing a focused interest in her specifically, not only as a drug trafficker, but as the organizing intelligence behind a pattern of violence that was beginning to have political consequences for a city that depended on its image as a tourist and business destination. The killings were generating press coverage. The press coverage was generating political pressure. The political pressure was generating investigative resources. The walls were not yet closing, but they were acquiring a direction of movement that, in retrospect, is clearly visible in the documentary record. The informants were beginning to talk. The financial trails were being followed. The organizational structure that Griselda had built to distribute risk was, in the hands of investigators who had been studying it for years, beginning to yield its internal logic. She did not appear from the outside to register this as urgency. She continued to operate. She continued to expand. She continued to make decisions that produced bodies and money in approximately equal measure. The city outside her operation was accumulating the cost of what she had built. In the neighborhoods where the violence concentrated, in the families of the dead, in the institutions of a city that was beginning to understand that it was hosting something it could not easily contain. The weight was real and growing. Inside the operation, the movement continued. The money moved. The product moved. The motorcycles moved through Miami traffic with their particular errand. And Griselda watched it all from a position that felt, to her, like control. Because it had always felt like control. Because she had built it to feel that way. Because the feeling of control was the one thing she had been constructing since the barrio in Medellin, and she had never, in all the years since, seriously entertained the possibility that it might be something other than what it felt like. There were 3 husbands. This is the number that appears in the formal record, though the word husband applied to the men in Griselda's life, carries implications of mutuality and shared construction that the actual relationships did not support. What there were, more accurately, were 3 men who occupied the position of husband at different stages of her operational development. Men who were useful, then less useful, then dangerous, then gone. The progression was not identical in each case. The endings differed in their mechanics, but the underlying structure was consistent enough across all 3 to suggest not a series of failed relationships, but a single relationship pattern repeated with different personnel. Understanding this pattern requires sitting with the discomfort that the more dramatic elements of Griselda's story tend to obscure. The violence of her endings with these men, and 2 of the 3 endings were violent in ways that are not metaphorical, can draw attention away from what the relationships looked like in their functioning phases, when the violence was still latent and the utility was still present. It is in those functioning phases that the pattern is most clearly visible and most instructive about the particular shape of Griselda's inner life. Carlos Trujillo has been discussed already. The first husband, the Medellin years, the marriage as operational cover. What is worth returning to here is the question of what, if anything, Trujillo represented to Griselda beyond his utility. The honest answer is that the record does not preserve enough detail about their personal relationship to answer this with confidence. What it does preserve is the fact of the children, the sons who carried Trujillo's name into a world that would eventually be organized entirely around their mothers. And the abruptness with which Trujillo disappeared from the narrative once his usefulness had been exhausted. He was not killed, as far as the record indicates. He was simply left. This is, in its own way, as informative as the more violent endings that followed. Griselda did not require the deaths of men who posed no threat. She required their removal from her operational environment when they ceased to serve a purpose. Trujillo ceased to serve a purpose. He was removed. Whether he understood what had happened to him, whether he comprehended, in the years that followed, the nature of what he had been part of, the record does not say. He disappears from the story with the completeness of someone who was never quite fully in it. Alberto Bravo was different. He was the husband of the New York years, the man whose operational resources had combined with Griselda's to produce something larger than either could have built independently. He was, as noted earlier, the closest thing to an approximate equal that Griselda appears to have encountered in the men she chose as partners, and it was precisely this quality. The fact that he had resources, connections, and a standing within the cocaine networks that were not entirely dependent on her, that made the deterioration of their relationship take the particular form it took. The marriage functioned, for a period, as intended. The combined operation moved product efficiently. The financial returns were substantial. Bravo had contacts in Colombia that complemented Griselda's distribution infrastructure in New York. The arrangement was, in purely business terms, productive. The problem was money. Specifically, the problem was Bravo's money. Or rather, the question of whose money it was, once the 2 operations had been combined under a shared structure. Griselda's accounting of the partnership's finances and Bravo's accounting did not agree. The disagreement was not minor. It involved, by the accounts that survive from people connected to this period, very large sums. The kind of discrepancy that, in a legitimate business context, might result in litigation or dissolution of partnership, and that, in an illegitimate one, resulted in something else entirely. They met in Colombia to resolve it. The meeting was in Medellin, on territory that was, in the grammar of the cocaine world, nominally neutral, but practically speaking weighted by the fact that Griselda had deeper roots there than Bravo did. What happened at that meeting has been described by people who were not present, but who were told about it afterward by people who were. The accounts are consistent in their broad outlines. Bravo arrived with weapons. Griselda arrived with more weapons. The confrontation that followed resulted in Bravo's death and in Griselda sustaining a wound, a bullet that struck her, but did not kill her. She drove herself to medical attention. She survived. The financial dispute was resolved in the manner she had always resolved disputes, through the application of terminal force to the other party. The operation continued. Alberto Bravo did not. What is striking about this episode is not the violence. The violence was, by this point in her life, a standard operating procedure. What is striking is the choice of target. Bravo was not a peripheral figure who had become inconvenient. He was the man she had married. The man who was the father of Osvaldo, the man with whom she had built, across the New York years, an enterprise of genuine scale. That she killed him, personally, in the sense of being physically present at and participating in the confrontation that produced his death, speaks to something about the specific quality of her relationships with men who acquired real standing within her world. She could tolerate men who were clearly subordinate, who had no independent claim to the resources or the enterprise. She could not, it appears, tolerate men who had developed a position from which they might contest her ownership of what she had built. Bravo had developed such a position. He had, through the years of their partnership, accumulated a standing within the cocaine networks that was partially his own, rather than entirely derivative of hers. This made him, in the calculus she applied to human beings, not a partner, but a threat. And threats, in Griselda's operational philosophy, were not managed through negotiation or compromise. They were eliminated. Osvaldo lost his father to this calculus. He was a young child. The manner of his father's death, killed by his mother in a dispute over money, was another fact that had to be held at a careful internal distance in order for him to continue functioning within the family structure that Griselda presided over. It joined the accumulated weight of things that the children in this family carried without ceremony, without processing, without the benefit of any framework that might have helped them understand what the carrying was doing to them. Dario Sepulveda was the third husband and in some ways the most complicated case to examine. He entered Griselda's life in the mid-1970s, a Colombian man connected to the cocaine trade, younger than her, physically striking by the accounts of people who knew him. The relationship produced Dixon, the youngest son. It also produced, over the years of its duration, a dynamic that was less purely transactional than the relationships that had preceded it. Or at least, it produced a relationship in which the transactional elements were more thoroughly entangled with something that resembled, from the outside, genuine feeling. This is dangerous territory because the temptation when examining Griselda's personal life is either to strip it entirely of emotional content, to reduce her to a purely operational figure for whom other human beings existed only as instruments, or to overcorrect in the other direction and attribute to her a rich emotional interior that her behavior systematically contradicted. The truth, as far as it can be reconstructed, appears to be somewhere between these poles. She was capable of something that functioned like attachment, but the attachment operated within a framework that made certain outcomes inevitable regardless of the feeling. Sepulveda was not, by the accounts available, simply compliant. He had his own ideas about how the operation should be run, his own connections within the Colombian networks, his own sense of himself as a man of standing within a world where standing was measured in specific and well-understood ways. He and Griselda disagreed. The disagreements were not merely operational, si capitali. They had the quality of genuine conflict between two people who each believed with conviction that they understood the situation better than the other. The relationship deteriorated in the way that relationships deteriorate when both parties are armed. Both parties have organizations behind them, and neither party has access to any mechanism of dispute resolution short of violence. Sepulveda took Dixon to Colombia. This has been mentioned already in the context of Dixon's childhood, but it is worth examining here from Griselda's perspective, from the vantage point of what it meant to her. and what the response it produced reveals about the particular intersection of maternal feeling and operational logic in her psychology. The taking of Dixon was, on Sepulveda's part, an attempt to use the child as leverage. It was, in the grammar of their relationship and their world, an aggressive move, a signal that he was willing to escalate, that he had resources and determination she needed to take seriously. It was also, in a dimension that may have been less consciously calculated, an act directed at the one area where Griselda's responses were least predictable. The one area where something other than pure operational logic might govern her behavior. Her response was to have him killed. The killing of Sepulveda has been examined by investigators and journalists primarily as an act of criminal violence, which it was. What it also was, and what tends to get less attention, is an act that foreclosed every other possible resolution. Once Sepulveda was dead, Dixon's relationship to his father was permanent and irrevocable. The loss could not be repaired by changed circumstances, by a negotiated settlement, by the passage of time. It was fixed, and it was fixed by the person who was simultaneously the only parent Dixon had left. The pattern across the three husbands, the abandonment of Trujillo, the killing of Bravo, the killing of Sepulveda, is not one of a woman who repeatedly chose poorly and suffered for it. It is the pattern of a woman who chose consistently, according to a consistent logic, and whose choices produced consistent outcomes that she then had to manage. The management took different forms depending on the specific circumstances. The underlying algorithm was unchanged. What the pattern also reveals when examined closely is the specific shape of Griselda's loneliness. This requires care because loneliness is a word that does not sit easily in the context of her life. A life so thoroughly populated with people, so thoroughly organized around the management of human relationships, that isolation seems like the wrong register entirely. But there is a particular kind of loneliness that is produced precisely by the inability to enter into a relationship without simultaneously calculating its utility and its termination conditions. It is the loneliness of someone who has learned so thoroughly to treat human connection as a resource to be managed that genuine connection, the kind that involves real uncertainty, real vulnerability, real exposure to the possibility of being changed by another person, has become functionally inaccessible. Griselda had learned this inaccessibility in the barrio. She had refined it through the Trujillo years. She had made it operational policy through Bravo and Sepulveda. By the time she was established in Miami in the early 1980s, it was not a strategy she deployed. It was the structure of her inner life. The men were gone. The operation continued. The sons remained, the sons she had built, armored, and positioned within the enterprise, who were in their own way as bound to her as she was to the logic that had produced them. She had arranged things over decades so that she would never be left again in the way the barrio had left her. What she had also arranged, without intending to, was a world from which there was no exit that did not involve catastrophic loss. Because she had made herself so completely the center of gravity of everything around her that any movement away from that center threatened to pull everything apart. She stayed at the center. She always stayed at the center. It was the only position she had ever known how to occupy. Uber Trujillo was shot and killed in Medellin in 1992. He was in his 30s. The killing was connected, by the accounts of people familiar with the Colombian cocaine networks of that period, to disputes within those networks. The specific kind of violence that the cocaine trade produced in Colombia throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s, when the Medellin cartel was simultaneously at the peak of its power and beginning the internal fracturing that would eventually destroy it. Uber had returned to Colombia after the Miami years, after his mother's arrest, after the collapse of the operational structure that had given his life its organizing purpose. He was killed in the city where he had been born, the city his mother had left decades earlier in search of something larger. He came back to it, and it killed him, in the way that cities sometimes return what they were given, changed in form, unchanged in essence. The specific circumstances of his death, who ordered it, what specific dispute or debt or perceived transgression it settled, are not fully established in the available record. What is established is that Uber, in the years between his mother's arrest and his death, had been attempting to operate within the Colombian cocaine networks without the organizational backing that Griselda's operation had previously provided. He was, in those years, a diminished figure, someone whose standing derived from a name and a history rather than from current operational power. This is a dangerous position in environments where power is the primary currency and where the memory of past power is not a reliable substitute for its present reality. He had been raised to function inside a specific structure. When that structure was removed, he did not have the resources, internal or external, to construct a replacement. He had been given by his upbringing enormous capacity within a defined operational context and very little capacity outside it. The question of what Uber's death meant to Griselda is one that the record cannot answer with precision. She was in federal custody in the United States when he was killed, incarcerated, isolated from the operational world that had defined her existence, navigating the particular deprivations of a prison environment in ways that are not thoroughly documented. Whether she received word of his death quickly or slowly, whether she was able to express grief in any form, whether the grief itself, if it existed, was distinguishable in her inner experience from the operational loss of a capable and trusted member of her network, are questions that the archive does not answer. What can be said is that Uber's death was the first of the three sons' fates to become irrevocable, and it arrived at a moment when Griselda had no ability to respond to it operationally, no ability to retaliate, to investigate, to apply the mechanisms she had always applied to threats and losses. She was, for the first time in her adult life, genuinely powerless in the face of something that had been done to her family. This powerlessness was not a new condition for the world she had created. It was rather the first time that world had turned its characteristic logic fully in her direction. Osvaldo's end came differently. He was shot in Miami in 1983, before his mother's arrest, during the period when the operation was still functioning and the violence was still, from Griselda's perspective, manageable. He was in his early 20s. The killing was connected to the Miami cocaine wars, to the specific network of disputes and retaliations and counter-retaliations that the concentrated violence of that period produced. The details of who killed Osvaldo and precisely why are disputed in the accounts that survive. What is consistent is the context. He was killed in the environment his mother had created, by the mechanisms his mother had established as the primary form of dispute resolution in that environment. The violence that had been directed outward at competitors and subordinates and anyone who represented a threat or an inconvenience to the operation had turned inward, had found in Osvaldo a target that was inside the perimeter rather than outside it. Griselda's response to Osvaldo's death is one of the few moments in her documented history where the accounts of people who knew her suggest something that does not fit neatly into the operational framework through which she typically processed events. She was, by multiple accounts, genuinely devastated. The controlled quality that she maintained across almost all circumstances, the management of affect that had been a consistent feature of her presentation, since the earliest accounts of people who knew her, appears to have fractured around Osvaldo's death in ways that were visible to people around her. This fracturing is significant not because it humanizes her in a way that should alter the moral assessment of what she had done, but because of what it reveals about the specific nature of her attachment to Osvaldo. He was, of the three sons, the one whose attachment to her had been most complete, the one who had existed most thoroughly within the gravity of her identity, rather than at some small distance from it. His death was not only the loss of a person she had loved, in whatever form love was available to her. It was the loss of the person who had most completely reflected back to her the image of herself as a mother, as someone whose children needed her, were organized around her, found their orientation in her presence. With Osvaldo gone, that reflection was partially extinguished, and there is something in the accounts of Griselda in the months after his death, in the descriptions of her behavior by people who were close to the operation during that period, that suggests a quality of disorientation that went beyond grief in the conventional sense, as though a reference point had been removed and the recalibration required was not only emotional, but something more fundamental. She ordered more killings after Osvaldo died. This is documented. The period immediately following his death saw an escalation in the violence attributed to her organization, a wave of retaliatory killings that were, by the accounts of investigators who were tracking the operation during this period, broader in scope and less precisely targeted than the killings that had preceded them, as though the discipline that had always characterized her use of violence, the strategic quality, the deliberate proportionality, had been temporarily loosened by something that could not be managed through the ordinary mechanisms of operational control. The investigators who were building the federal case against her during this period noted this escalation. It was, in a purely practical sense, useful to them. Undisciplined violence leaves more evidence, more witnesses, more trails. But it is also, viewed from a different angle, a kind of biographical testimony. It is evidence that Osvaldo's death produced in Griselda a response that exceeded her capacity to contain it within her operational framework. That grief, or something in the vicinity of grief, overwhelmed, briefly, the management systems she had spent a lifetime constructing. The management systems reasserted themselves. They always did. But the period of their loosening left marks, in the documentary record, in the memories of survivors, in the escalating attention of law enforcement, that would eventually contribute to her arrest. Dixon was the son who lived longest in proximity to the consequences of what his mother had built. He was a child during the Miami years, too young for full operational involvement, but old enough to be fully immersed in the environment, to know what the phone calls meant, what the visitors wanted, what happened to people who disappointed his mother. He grew up in a world where sudden death was not a theoretical possibility, but a concrete fact of the social landscape. Something that happened to people he knew, people who had sat at his mother's table, people whose names he recognized. His father's killing, and ordered by his mother, conducted by her organization, sat inside him in the way that irresolvable facts sit inside people who have no available mechanism for resolving them. He could not mourn his father openly without, in some dimension, indicting his mother. He could not fully align himself with his mother without, in some dimension, betraying his father. The only available position was the one he appears to have occupied, a kind of permanent suspension between these two poles, functional enough on the surface, carrying beneath the surface a weight that had no name and no outlet. He was eventually arrested in the years after Griselda's own arrest on charges connected to drug trafficking. The charges were not surprising given the world he had been raised in. What is worth noting is the trajectory. A young man raised inside a criminal empire, denied by circumstance and by the specific conditions of his upbringing any realistic access to a different path, following the only road that had been laid out for him with a consistency that had all the appearance of choice and almost none of its substance. There is a particular irony, not the neat literary kind, but the blunt, factual kind, in the fate of Griselda's sons. She had built the operation in her own framing for them. She had provided through the violence and the product and the money and the management of human beings as instruments, a world in which her children would be powerful, protected, and secure in ways that she had never been. This was the explicit content of her maternal narrative, the story she told about herself as a mother, the justification she offered for the architecture she had constructed. The architecture killed 2 of her 3 sons. It crippled the third in ways that were less visible, but no less real. The protection she had provided was indistinguishable in its outcomes from the violence she had deployed against her enemies. The world she had built to shield her children was the same world that destroyed them. This is not a conclusion that requires the imposition of irony. It is simply what happened, documented in court records and death certificates and the accounts of people who survived the Miami years and the Columbia years and the long aftermath of both. The grief that Griselda carried for her sons, and there is no reason, based on the available evidence, to doubt that she carried it, existed alongside her undiminished conviction that what she had done was right. This is perhaps the most psychologically dense aspect of the whole story. She does not appear, in any account, to have arrived at a point where she connected the deaths of her children to the choices she had made in raising them. The deaths were losses she bore. The choices were things she had done correctly. These two facts occupied different compartments in her psychology, and the wall between them appears to have remained intact until the end. This kind of compartmentalization is not unusual in people who have organized their lives around a particular identity and a particular set of justifications. The alternative, allowing the two facts to come into contact, allowing the losses to interrogate the choices, allowing the possibility that the things she had done for her children had also been done to them, would have required a degree of self-examination that her entire psychological history had been organized to avoid. She had decided, in the barrio, who she was and what was required to survive. She had spent 40 years acting on that decision with extraordinary consistency. The suggestion that the decision itself might have been the problem was not something she could accommodate without dismantling something that was, by that point, the load-bearing structure of her entire sense of self. The sons were gone. The structure remained. And she carried both of these facts with her into the arrest that was coming, into the cage that would, for the first time, make the weight of what she had built genuinely inescapable. The arrest happened on February 17, 1985. It was not dramatic in the way that the mythology of Griselda Blanco tends to demand drama. There was no shootout, no chase, no confrontation that would have suited the scale of what she had built. A federal task force located her in Irvine, California, a suburb of Los Angeles, quiet and residential, the kind of place that exists in deliberate contrast to the environments she had inhabited throughout her adult life. She was taken into custody without significant incident. The address where she was found was unremarkable. The house was ordinary. She had been living in the months before the arrest in a condition of relative domestic normalcy, or at least in the external performance of domestic normalcy that she had always been capable of producing on short notice, whenever the operational environment required a period of reduced visibility. The federal investigators who had been building the case against her for years, through informants, through financial records, through the patient reconstruction of the organizational structure she had designed to distribute risk, had followed the threads far enough that the distance between her and the evidence had finally collapsed. She was 52 years old. She had been operating continuously in the cocaine trade for approximately 20 years. She had survived a bullet, 3 husbands, 2 sons, multiple federal investigations, and the sustained violence of the Miami cocaine wars. She was arrested in a quiet California suburb while the machinery of a federal prosecution assembled itself around her with the unhurried thoroughness of something that had been in preparation for a very long time. The federal case against her was built on a conspiracy charge related to her cocaine trafficking operation, specifically to the New York network that had been the subject of investigation since the 1970s. The Miami killings, which were the most publicly visible aspect of her criminal career, presented a more complicated prosecutorial challenge. Murder cases require witnesses. In the Miami cocaine world of the late 1970s and early 1980s, witnesses had a specific tendency to become unavailable in ways that were connected to Griselda's organization. This witness problem was not accidental. It was the product of a deliberate and sustained effort, conducted across years, to ensure that the people who had direct knowledge of the killings either could not testify or would not. Informants who had cooperated with investigators disappeared. People who had been present at specific incidents and who might have been useful to prosecutors found reasons, some of which were supplied by Griselda's organization in the form of direct threat, some of which were the product of the rational self-interest calculations of people who understood what happened to people who testified, to reconsider their willingness to appear in court. The result was a prosecution that was, by the standards of what the evidence actually established about Griselda's role in Miami's violence, significantly narrower than the full scope of her criminal history. The federal conspiracy charge to which the case was anchored was real and thoroughly documented. The murders, the 40 or more killings attributed to her organization, were present in the background of the prosecution, as context, as atmosphere, as the quality of person the jury was being asked to evaluate. They were not, in most cases, individually charged crimes for which she was held directly accountable at trial. She understood this. The legal strategy her defense team employed was built, in part, around this understanding, around the gap between what the prosecution could prove and what the totality of her history actually contained. This gap was not an accident of prosecutorial incompetence. It was the accumulated product of decades of careful organizational construction, of the layers of intermediary and the management of witnesses and the deliberate distribution of operational knowledge across a network designed so that no single person, and ideally no single document, could connect her directly to any specific act. The architecture she had built to protect the operation protected her, to a significant degree, from the full legal accounting of what she had done. She was convicted. The sentence and the subsequent legal history of her incarceration went through multiple phases: appeals, modifications, additional charges, periods in different federal facilities. She served time in California and Florida in the federal system's movement of prisoners that has its own logic disconnected from the geography of a person's life. The precise chronology of her incarceration, which charges, which sentences, which facilities, at which times, is a legal document rather than a biographical one, and the legal document is detailed in ways that are not fully illuminating about the human experience it describes. What is more illuminating is the texture of what prison meant for Griselda specifically. What incarceration does to a person whose entire adult existence has been organized around the exercise of absolute control over her environment and the people in it. The prison environment is, by design, the systematic removal of individual control. Every significant parameter of daily life, when you sleep, when you eat, when you move, who you speak to, what you have access to, is determined by institutional rules rather than personal decision. For most people who enter the federal prison system, this loss of control is experienced as punishment in the most basic sense, the removal of the ordinary freedoms that define adult autonomy. For Griselda, the removal operated on a different register. She had not been exercising ordinary adult autonomy. She had been exercising something closer to sovereignty, the power to determine outcomes for other people, to organize the behavior of dozens or hundreds of individuals through a combination of incentive and threat, to make decisions that ended lives and changed the trajectories of families and neighborhoods and institutions. Prison did not simply remove her freedom. It removed her from a position of power that had been, for 20 years, the organizing center of her identity and her sense of self. The accounts of her behavior inside the federal prison system are fragmentary. Prison records are not public documents in the way that court records are, and the people who were present with her during this period are not, in most cases, people who have spoken extensively to journalists or investigators about what they observed. What does emerge from the fragments is a picture of a woman who adapted to the prison environment with the same quality of attention she had always brought to new operational contexts, who quickly understood the social hierarchies of the institution, who positioned herself within those hierarchies with care, and who maintained throughout her incarceration a quality of personal authority that people in proximity to her registered without always being able to explain. She was not, by the accounts available, a broken figure in prison. She was not visibly diminished in the way that incarceration visibly diminishes some people, hollowing them out, stripping them of the confidence and presence that had defined them outside. She retained a quality of density, of concentrated presence that had always been one of her defining characteristics. People in the federal facilities where she was housed were aware of her in the way that people are aware of someone who occupies more psychological space than their physical circumstances would suggest. What she was and what the prison years appear to have produced in a way that the operational years had not, was cut off. Cut off from information about the world outside in the specific way that incarceration produces. Not the complete isolation of a sensory deprivation experiment, but the partial, managed disconnection of someone who receives filtered and delayed information about a world that is continuing without her, making decisions and generating consequences that she can observe but not influence. The Colombian cocaine world did not pause for her incarceration. The networks she had built in Miami and New York were disrupted by her arrest but not destroyed. Criminal organizations have a specific resilience to the removal of individual figures, a capacity to redistribute function and reassemble structure that mirrors, in its own way, the organizational redundancy she had always built into the enterprise. Some of what she had built continued, Some was absorbed by other organizations. Some collapsed in the specific way that structures collapse when the intelligence that held them together is removed. Pablo Escobar was consolidating the Medellin cartel during this period. The scale of what Escobar assembled in the late 1980s was, in purely quantitative terms, larger than anything Griselda had built, larger in revenue, in territorial reach, in the sophistication of its political corruption, in the audacity of its confrontation with the Colombian state. Her name appears in the margins of the Escobar period. As a predecessor, as someone whose organizational innovations the cartel built upon, as a figure whose Miami operation had helped establish the distribution infrastructure that later networks would use. She was aware of this inside the federal prison system in the fragmented way that information reaches incarcerated people. Whether she experienced this awareness as pride or as the particular bitterness of watching something you built be absorbed and dwarfed by successors who would not fully acknowledge the foundation, or as simple neutral observation, is not recorded. The witnesses continued to disappear during her incarceration. This is documented, not as a continuous campaign of organized intimidation, but as a pattern that investigators noticed and that had a specific effect on the prospects for additional prosecution. Several individuals who had cooperated with federal investigators in building the case against Griselda, or who had been identified as potential witnesses in future proceedings, died or became otherwise unavailable during the years of her incarceration. The mechanisms by which this happened were not, in most cases, directly traceable to her. She was in federal custody. The organizational infrastructure that might have carried out such actions was disrupted, but the disappearance of witnesses is a phenomenon that, in the context of Griselda's history, is difficult to read as entirely coincidental. As the product of bad luck that happened to concentrate specifically around people whose testimony would have been damaging to her. What the witness disappearances did, practically, was narrow the already narrow channel of legal accountability. They ensured that the gap between what she had done and what could be proven in court remained substantial. They preserved, against the possibility of future prosecution, the same organizational architecture of deniability that had protected her throughout the operational years. Whether this was deliberate, whether she was directing, from inside federal custody, the management of her legal exposure, or whether it was the residual functioning of an organizational culture she had established and that continued to operate according to its own logic in her absence, is a question the record raises without answering. The Miami she had left behind was, by the late 1980s, in the process of becoming something different from what it had been during the cocaine wars. The violence had not ended. The drug economy continued to generate the conditions for violence with remarkable consistency. But the specific period of maximum chaos, the years when the motorcycle assassins moved through traffic and the bodies accumulated in ways that the city's institutions could barely process, had passed. The city was reassembling its public face. The infrastructure of tourism and development and financial services that would define Miami in the 1990s and afterward was being laid down over the physical and institutional landscape of the cocaine years. The people who had died in those years were not being forgotten exactly. They were being archived, moved from the active file of present concern into the historical record, where they would eventually become the material of documentaries and true crime narratives and academic studies of organized crime. The families they had left behind continued to carry what those families carry, the specific weight of violent loss, which does not archive itself in the way that public memory archives its subjects. Griselda in federal prison was also being archived, in a sense. The active investigation was concluded. The prosecution was complete. She was a convicted federal prisoner serving a sentence, a category with its own institutional processing, its own removal from the active present into a kind of suspended condition where time passes differently than it does outside. She was not, however, finished. She had never, in her entire adult life, arrived at a condition that she experienced as finished. The prison was a constraint. It was also, in the terms she had always operated in, a condition to be managed, a new environment with new parameters, new power structures to map, new resources to identify, and new vulnerabilities to exploit. The sentence would end. The operational world outside would have changed, but it would still be there. Her sons, the ones who remained, would still be navigating it. The name she had built, the reputation she had assembled across decades of violence and enterprise, would still carry weight in the specific communities where such weight was measured. She served her time. She watched the world through the filtered channel of information available to her. She maintained the quality of concentrated presence that people in her proximity registered with unease. And somewhere in the accounting she conducted across those years in federal custody, the inventory of what had been lost and what remained and what might still be possible, the particular silence of a prison cell held, without resolution, everything she had built and everyone it had cost. She was deported to Colombia in June 2004. The deportation followed her release from federal custody, a release that itself had been preceded by years of legal maneuvering, sentence modifications, and the particular bureaucratic complexity that accumulates around a case as layered as hers had become over 2 decades of prosecution and incarceration. She had served approximately 10 years in the American federal system when she was finally returned to the country she had left 40 years earlier, carrying forged documents and children and a set of skills that the Medellin slums had refined into something the world had not yet seen. She was 71 years old. She returned to Medellin. The city she came back to was not the city she had left. Medellin in 2004 was a city in a specific phase of its own complicated history, a city that had survived Pablo Escobar, survived the years of cartel warfare, survived a period of urban violence so extreme that it had entered the statistical record as one of the most dangerous cities on earth, and was now, tentatively and unevenly, in the early stages of a process that city planners and journalists would eventually describe as transformation. New infrastructure, civic investment. A deliberate effort to construct a public narrative about Medellin that was not organized around the cocaine years and the violence they had produced. Griselda Blanco returned to this city not as a figure of its present, but as a remnant of its past, a past that the city was, in its official posture, attempting to place at a careful distance from its current identity. There was no reception. There was no acknowledgement from the criminal networks that remained in the city, networks that were, by 2004, organized around different structures and different personnel than the ones she had left behind. There was no ceremony of return, no recognition of her arrival that carried any weight in the world she had once occupied. She arrived, and the city absorbed her with the indifference that cities extend to returnees who no longer represent current power. The Medellin she settled into was a city that knew her name without particularly needing her presence. The mythology of Griselda Blanco, the Godmother, the Black Widow, the organizing intelligence behind the Miami cocaine wars, had, over the years of her incarceration, accumulated the specific quality of stories that have been repeated often enough and in enough different contexts that they develop a life partially independent of their subject. She had become, in her absence, a figure, a narrative shorthand for a particular kind of criminal ambition and a particular kind of violence. The actual woman who returned in 2004 was 71, in declining health from the accumulated physical consequences of a life lived at the specific metabolic pace of criminal enterprise. The stress, the movement, the inadequate and irregular care for the body that becomes normal when survival and operational management occupy all available attention. She was heavier than she had been. She moved with less ease. The particular physical presence that people who had known her in the operational years described, the density, the concentrated quality that made rooms feel different when she entered them, was muted, though not entirely gone. She lived quietly. This is the phrase that appears, with a consistency that has the quality of deliberate understatement in the accounts of people who knew her Medellin years. She lived quietly. She kept a low profile. She did not seek visibility. She was present in the city in the way that a large object is present in a small room. Everyone was aware of her, but the awareness was managed through a kind of collective discretion, an unspoken agreement that her presence would not be commented upon in ways that might require anyone to decide what to do about it. The Colombian legal system had its own relationship with her history. There were matters that might, under different circumstances, have resulted in prosecution. Colombian courts had their own interests in the events of the cocaine wars, their own accounting to conduct of the violence and the money and the damage that the trade had done to the country's institutions and its people over decades. But the specific conditions of 2004, the state of the Colombian legal system, the political environment, the practical difficulties of constructing a prosecution around events that were decades old and whose witnesses and evidence had been subjected to 30 years of attrition meant that no serious legal proceedings were initiated against her on her return. She was simply there, in the city, in an apartment, by most accounts, that was comfortable without being ostentatious. A living situation scaled to her current circumstances, rather than to the peak of what she had once been able to afford. The extraordinary wealth that her operation had generated at its height had been significantly eroded by the costs of legal defense over decades, by asset seizure, by the disruption of revenue that incarceration inevitably produced, by the dissipation that tends to affect criminal fortunes in the absence of the organizing intelligence that created them. She was not destitute, but she was not wealthy in the way that the Miami years had made her wealthy. The money, like so much else, had been spent or taken or had simply disappeared into the organizational entropy that follows the collapse of a criminal enterprise. Dixon was, by this period, the only son still living. Uber had been killed in Medellin in 1992. Osvaldo had been killed in Miami in 1983. Dixon had survived, had navigated his own arrests and legal proceedings and the specific difficulties of being Griselda Blanco's son in a world where that name carried precise and well-understood implications and was present in Colombia during at least some of the years of his mother's return. The relationship between Griselda and Dixon in these years is not thoroughly documented. What fragments exist suggest something more complicated than the operational relationship she had maintained with her older sons during the Miami years, complicated by the specific history between them, by the knowledge that both carried of what she had done to his father, by the particular quality of a relationship in which the debt and the damage and the love and the dependency were so thoroughly entangled that any attempt to separate them would have required dismantling the relationship entirely. He was the only one left. Whatever the relationship contained, whatever accumulated weight of grief and complicity, and the specific love that survives the knowledge of what the beloved has done, it was the only version of the maternal relationship that remained available to either of them. They managed it, as the accounts suggest, in the way that people manage the irresolvable, with a practical continuity that does not require the irresolvable to be resolved. Medellin, in the years of Griselda's return, was engaged in a process of public memory management that had its own particular relationship to her presence. The city's official narrative of transformation, the story it was telling about itself to the world and to its own citizens, required a degree of distance from the cocaine years and their principal figures. Pablo Escobar's legacy was being actively contested in the city's public spaces. The buildings that had borne his name were being renamed. The informal shrines that had appeared after his death in 1993 were being quietly discouraged. The tourist infrastructure that had grown up around his story was regarded with ambivalence by city officials who understood its economic value and discomfort with its implications. Griselda did not have Escobar's posthumous celebrity, even while she was still living. She had been, in the American telling of the cocaine years, a significant figure. Her story had appeared in books, in documentary treatments, in the journalistic reconstruction of the Miami cocaine wars. In Colombia, the specific texture of her reputation was different. She was known, but she was not mythologized in quite the way that Escobar had been mythologized, with the particular combination of fear and perverse admiration and class resentment that had made his story, for a certain portion of the Colombian population, into something more complicated than simple condemnation. She was older. She was a woman. The specific forms of identification that Escobar's story had generated, the working-class boy from Envigado who had defied the established order with sufficient force to bring the Colombian state to its knees, did not map onto her biography in the same way. She was a figure of the cocaine years, without being, in the Medellin of her return, a figure of any particular current significance. She spent her days in an apartment, She watched television by the accounts of people who had contact with her during this period. She ate at local restaurants, a detail that appears in multiple accounts of her final years. The ordinary domesticity of an elderly woman eating in the neighborhood places of a city that had known her when she was something other than elderly. She was recognized occasionally by people who knew who she was. The recognition was managed, in most cases, with the same collective discretion that governed the broader public awareness of her presence. A registering without acknowledgement. A seeing without seeing. The neighborhood where she lived was not El Poblado, the wealthy district of New Medellin with its restaurants and boutique hotels, and the architecture of the city's aspirational self-presentation. It was a more ordinary neighborhood, the kind of neighborhood that the city's transformation had reached unevenly, where the infrastructure of improvement was present in some blocks and absent in others, where daily life had the texture of a place that is neither the city's showcase nor its forgotten margin. She was an old woman in an ordinary neighborhood. This sentence contains something that the years of the operational history make difficult to hold. The simple fact of ordinary life reduced to its basic dimensions as the endpoint of everything the preceding decades had contained. Her health declined through the 2000s and into the early 2010s. The specific conditions are not thoroughly documented. She was not a person who had maintained the kind of relationship with medical institutions that produces a detailed health record, and the accounts of people who saw her during this period are impressionistic rather than clinical. What they consistently describe is the visible physical diminishment of age compounded by the specific wear of a life lived at the metabolic intensity hers had been, the weight, the reduced mobility, the general quality of a body that had been subjected to decades of stress and privation and had arrived at its final years carrying the accumulated physical cost. She did not speak publicly about her history during this period. There were no interviews, no memoirs, no attempt to construct a public narrative about her life and what it had contained. This silence was not, in all probability, the product of remorse or of a reluctance to revisit painful material. It was more likely the product of the same operational instinct that had always governed her relationship to information. The understanding that speaking about the past created exposure, that documentation created vulnerability, that the safest posture was the one she had always maintained, visible in the immediate environment, opaque about everything beneath the surface. She had lived by that posture for 70 years. She maintained it into old age with the consistency of something that had become long ago simply the structure of her personality, rather than a strategic choice made in response to specific conditions. The city moved around her. The transformation of Medellin continued, the cable cars connecting the hillside barrios to the city center, the new library in Commune 13, the urban renewal projects that were winning international design awards and attracting a specific kind of attention from cities around the world that were trying to understand how a place associated primarily with catastrophic violence could reconstitute itself as a symbol of civic possibility. The barrios where Griselda had grown up were part of this narrative, not as places that had produced her, but as places that were being remade, that were being connected to the city's center in new ways, that were being offered a relationship to the city's future that they had not previously had. The poverty that had shaped her was still present, in altered forms. The violence that had been ambient in her childhood was still present, in altered forms. The informal economies that had educated her were still present, in altered forms. She had come out of this city and had returned to it and was living in it as it attempted to become something other than what it had been when she left. She had no visible relationship to that attempt. She was present in the city the way that a geological formation is present, as evidence of historical forces that had produced a specific shape, now simply existing within a landscape that had grown up around it, and was, with varying degrees of success, learning to look elsewhere. In the mornings, she went out. She ate breakfast sometimes at a butcher shop near her apartment that she visited regularly enough to be a familiar presence to the people who worked there. An old woman who came in, who ate, who occupied a table with the ordinary purposiveness of someone whose daily routine had contracted to these small, manageable dimensions. She went out on the morning of September 3, 2012. The butcher shop was called La Feria de los Chorizos. It sat in the Belen Aguas Frias neighborhood of Medellin. a working-class district not far from the center of the city, the kind of neighborhood where the morning moves at a domestic pace, where the shops open early and the foot traffic is local, and the rhythms of daily life are visible on the street in a way they are not in the wealthier, more enclosed parts of the city. It was the kind of place Griselda Blanco had grown up near, had spent her childhood navigating, had left behind in the specific pursuit of everything that such neighborhoods could not provide. She was shot once in the back of the head. A single bullet. The shooter arrived on foot, not this time the motorcycle that had been the signature of her own organization's killings across 30 years of operational history, though later accounts would describe a motorcycle nearby. The detail arriving with the quality of something that is either significant coincidence or deliberate echo. She died at the scene. She was 79 years old. The killing was quick. It had the efficiency of a professional act. Clean, targeted without collateral damage, conducted in a public space with the casualness of someone who had assessed the environment and found it acceptable. It was, in its technique and its execution, a killing that resembled the killings she had ordered across decades of criminal operation. This resemblance was noted in the immediate aftermath by Colombian journalists and by the investigators who arrived at the scene. It was noted, and then it sat there without resolution, a fact that the record acknowledged without fully absorbing. The Colombian police investigated. The investigation produced the expected public statements about pursuing leads and identifying suspects. It did not, in the months and years that followed, produce a conviction, a trial, or a publicly established account of who had ordered her death and why. The killing of Griselda Blanco entered the archive of unsolved cases that the Colombian criminal landscape generates, with a consistency that reflects the particular difficulty of investigating violence in an environment where the networks that produce violence also govern the flow of information about it. Various theories circulated in the Colombian press and in the international coverage that her death generated. Old debts from the Miami years, a dispute within the Colombian criminal network she had maintained contact with after her return, a personal grievance rooted in the accumulated history of a life that had produced enough enemies to sustain almost any speculative narrative about motive. None of these theories were publicly confirmed. None were publicly ruled out. She had spent her operational life ensuring that the line between decision and consequence could not be traced by investigators. The people who killed her appear to have operated according to the same principle. The architecture of deniability that she had always imposed on her own operations enclosed, in the end, the operation that was conducted against her. The international coverage of her death had a specific quality that is worth examining. The obituaries and news reports that appeared in the days following the shooting were, almost uniformly, organized around the mythology rather than the person. The Godmother, the Black Widow, the first to use motorcycle assassins, the woman who had ordered more than 200 killings. The figures were large, the language was vivid, and the coverage had the particular tone of a narrative that had already been assembled and needed only the news event of her death to be published. This coverage was not inaccurate exactly. The broad outlines of what she had done were real, and the scale of the violence was real, and the operational innovations she had brought to the cocaine trade were real. But the coverage was organized around the mythology in a way that consistently displaced the person, that treated the story of Griselda Blanco as a story about criminal achievement, about the audacity of what she had built and the scale of what she had destroyed, rather than as a story about a human being whose specific history had produced, through specific mechanisms, specific outcomes. The sons did not appear prominently in the obituaries. Osvaldo and Uber were mentioned, if at all, as footnotes, as evidence of the violence that surrounded their mother, rather than as people whose lives had their own weight and whose deaths had their own meaning. Dixon, living and present, was not substantially engaged by the coverage as a source of information about what the family's life had actually contained. The men she had married appeared in the coverage primarily as victims or co-conspirators. Their individual existences collapsed into their functional roles in her story. Alberto Bravo as the husband she killed, Dario Sepulveda as the husband she also killed, and whose son she retained. These characterizations were accurate as far as they went. They did not go far. The Colombian state did not, in the aftermath of her death, conduct any formal accounting of her legacy, any official acknowledgement of the specific damage her operation had done to Colombian institutions, to the communities where the cocaine trade had concentrated its effects, to the individuals and families who had been touched by the violence she had organized or directed or permitted. This absence was not surprising. The Colombian state's relationship to the cocaine years is complicated by the fact that the corruption those years produced extended into the institutions that would have conducted any such accounting. The capacity for self-examination is always limited by the degree to which the self in question participated in what is being examined. The Miami Police Department and the DEA, for their part, had their own archives of the period. The case files, the photographs, the accumulated documentation of what had happened in the city between 1978 and 1984. These archives existed in the institutional memory of organizations that had moved on, that had other priorities, that remembered the cocaine cowboys era as a significant chapter in the history of American drug enforcement without having any particular occasion to return to it. The people who had died in that era, the bystanders caught in the Dadeland shooting, the individuals targeted by Griselda's organization for reasons ranging from genuine threat to perceived disrespect to disputed debts, were present in those archives as case numbers, as photographs, as the evidentiary material of closed or cold investigations. Their families carried what families carry, in the specific ongoing way that loss operates in the lives of the people who survive it. What Griselda left behind, in the material sense, was limited. The extraordinary wealth of the Miami years had been substantially dissipated. The properties, the front businesses, the cash that had moved through her financial networks were gone, seized, spent, absorbed into the entropic processes that affect criminal fortunes across decades of legal attrition. What remained was modest. Dixon inherited what there was to inherit, in the practical sense. He also inherited, in the less practical sense, a name and a history that had its own ongoing effects on his navigation of the world. A legacy that was simultaneously a burden and a form of identity, impossible to fully separate from whatever he might have been in its absence. The estate, in the legal and financial sense, was unremarkable. The estate in the biographical sense, the totality of what she had produced and what she had consumed and what she had left altered by her passage through it, was something else entirely, though it was not organized in a way that made it legible as a single coherent object. The mythology continued after her death, as mythologies do. A television series appeared in 2023, Griselda, produced for Netflix starring Sofia Vergara, in a performance that received significant attention and that introduced her story to audiences who had not previously encountered it. The series was, by the conventions of its genre, organized around the drama of her rise and fall, the ambition, the violence, the glamour, the eventual collapse. It was competently made and widely watched and organized the material of her life into the narrative shape that audiences for such productions expect. The series did not spend significant time on the quality of her sons' childhoods. It did not examine at length what it had been like to be Carlos Trujillo or Alberto Bravo or Dario Sepulveda in the specific texture of their day-to-day lives in proximity to her. It did not examine what it had been like to be a neighbor of her operation in the Miami neighborhoods where the violence concentrated, or a family member of one of the dozens of people killed in the cocaine cowboys era. These were not failures of the production exactly. They were the product of the narrative choices that genre conventions produce, the selection of focus that turns a complicated history into a consumable story. But the distance between the consumable story and the full weight of the history is itself a kind of information. It tells you something about what the mythology requires and what it discards. It tells you that the story of Griselda Blanco, as it circulates in the culture, is organized around the figure, around the audacity, the violence, the improbability of what a girl from the Medellin slums built, and away from the accumulated cost of what the building required. The butcher shop where she was killed is still there. The neighborhood continues its daily life with the ordinary persistence of neighborhoods, the morning foot traffic, the shops opening, the routines of people whose lives have their own weight and their own content entirely apart from what happened there on September 3, 2012. The physical location does not advertise its history. There is no marker, no acknowledgement, no indication visible to a passerby that the spot has any particular significance in anyone's story. This is ordinary. Most places where significant things happen look, afterward, exactly like places where nothing has happened. The significance exists in the record and in the memories of people who were present, and those archives are not legible in the physical surface of the place. She died where she had been born, in a sense, not in the specific geography, but in the category. A working-class Medellin neighborhood, an ordinary morning, of violence that arrived without announcement and departed without explanation. The 40 years of empire, the cocaine and the money and the bodies and the trials, had resolved, at the end, into something that looked remarkably like the world she had started from. The question that the record does not answer, cannot answer by its nature, is what she understood in the years of the Medellin return about what her life had produced, whether the deaths of Osvaldo and Uber had, across the decades, accumulated into something that she eventually allowed to interrogate the choices that had shaped their upbringing, whether Dixon's continued presence in her life carried, for her, the weight of Dario Sepulveda's killing, whether the quiet of the Medellin apartment, the television, the morning breakfasts, the ordinary small dimensions of daily life in old age had given her any access to the interior accounting that the operational years had never permitted. The record does not answer this because she did not speak about it. She maintained, to the end, the opacity that had been her primary survival strategy since the barrio, the refusal to make her interior life available as information that others might use. Whether there was, behind that opacity, a woman who knew what she had done and carried it, or whether the opacity was all the way through, whether the compartmentalization had been so thorough and so durable that the interior accounting had simply never occurred, is the question the story leaves open. Both possibilities are available. Neither requires the other to be false. There is no document, no court record, no account from anyone who knew her that establishes what Griselda Blanco thought her life had amounted to. This absence is not incidental. It is consistent with everything she was. A person who understood, from early childhood, that disclosure was a form of vulnerability, and who spent 79 years ensuring that the distance between her inner life and the world's ability to access it remained intact. What the record does establish is a series of facts that sit beside each other without resolving into a single, coherent verdict. A girl born into a Medellin barrio that gave her nothing except the specific education of deprivation. A woman who built, from that education, an empire that the American cocaine trade had not previously seen organized with such consistency or maintained with such discipline. 3 husbands, 2 of them killed by her instruction. 3 sons raised inside the machinery of what she built, 2 of them killed by the same machinery before she was. Dozens of individual human lives ended by decisions made inside her organizational structure. A city, Miami, whose public landscape was altered in ways both visible and invisible by the years she operated within it. A Colombian city, Medellin, that absorbed her return with the indifference it extends to history it is trying to move past. These facts do not produce a moral conclusion that the story has earned the right to state cleanly. The weight of what she did resists the compression that moral conclusions require. What is harder to hold, and perhaps more worth holding, is the question of what the story reveals about the specific conditions that produced her, and about what those conditions continue to produce in the absence of any serious engagement with them. The barrio that shaped Griselda Blanco is not a historical artifact. The specific combination of poverty, violence, absent institutions, and the particular educational curriculum of deprivation that she absorbed as a child is a living condition in cities across the world. The lesson it teaches, that softness is a liability, that survival requires the suppression of vulnerability, that the people around you are either useful or dangerous, is being taught, without ceremony and without intent, to children who will grow into adults who have been formed by it in ways they will not always be able to articulate. This is not an argument that circumstances produce criminals deterministically, or that poverty explains violence in a way that removes individual agency from the accounting. It is something simpler and less comfortable. The observation that certain environments produce certain people, and that the people those environments produce carry the mark of their formation into everything they subsequently do, including the things they do to the people they love. Griselda Blanco's sons are the part of the story that the mythology consistently underweights. They were not peripheral figures in her narrative. They were its most direct output, the people most completely shaped by what she had decided to build, the people who paid most completely for what the building required. Uber and Osvaldo are dead. Dixon carried forward into a life whose available options had been substantially determined before he was old enough to choose. None of them had a name that belonged entirely to them. They were Griselda's sons before they were themselves, a condition that the world established for them before they had the language to contest it, and that the world maintained regardless of what they did or did not do within it. What they inherited was not wealth, in the end. It was a framework. For understanding power, for understanding relationship, for understanding what loyalty meant and what its absence cost. A framework that had been constructed for survival in an environment that no longer existed, by a person who had never found a way to update it, and that they carried into their own lives without the resources to dismantle it or the distance to examine it. She died outside a butcher shop on an ordinary morning. The shooter disappeared. The case was not solved. The city moved on with the ordinary momentum of cities, and the story passed into the register of mythology where it has been circulating since, amplified, simplified, organized around the drama of the rise and the violence of the fall, the working-class girl who became the godmother, the woman who did what men did with a thoroughness that men found difficult to fully comprehend. The mythology is not entirely wrong. She did build what the mythology says she built. She did do what the mythology says she did. What the mythology does not hold, what it cannot hold, by the nature of what mythology requires, is the full weight of the cost. The cost measured not in the abstractions of moral philosophy, but in the specific, individual, irrevocable losses of specific people whose lives were consumed by what she constructed. That weight does not have a monument. It does not have a name. It exists in the places the record does not look, in the families of the dead, in the interior life of a son who outlived his mother and his brothers and his father, in the neighborhoods that absorbed the violence and continued their daily life in the way that neighborhoods do, carrying everything forward without resolution. The story of Griselda Blanco does not settle. It accumulates, and the accumulation sits there in the record and beyond it, unchanged by the mythologies that have grown up around it, and undiminished by the years that continue to pass over it.